The call landed in the middle of a long afternoon when I was bent over a pile of essays at the kitchen table inside the cramped place I rented, the kind of space where every sound felt too close and every movement echoed off the walls. Rain tapped against the glass with that slow November rhythm that made everything feel heavier, and I almost let the unknown number fade into silence until something in me twitched and I answered. The voice on the line spoke with a practiced calm and told me the reading of the will was set, that I was expected to be there, that the woman who raised me had left instructions, and for a moment I just stared at the red pen in my hand, bleeding into a margin as if the paper itself was startled. I said yes before I even thought about it, and when the call ended my breath snagged in my throat because part of me had assumed for years that I would be quietly erased from whatever final decisions were waiting. The woman who shared my blood had been gone for 3 weeks. The farewell had been stiff and polite, a room full of strangers murmuring soft words they did not mean, while the elder one and I kept a careful distance between us. She had perfected the art of looking at me without seeing me, and I had long stopped expecting anything else. After the call, the essays in front of me blurred until the sentences lost their shape. I tried to focus on the neat lines my students had written, but the past kept pushing itself forward, reminding me of that last real fight so many years ago when the elder one had turned to me with blazing certainty and told me I was wasting everything I had been given, that choosing a quiet life was proof of weakness, that the woman who raised us must have been ashamed of the path I'd taken. I remember how the words had hung between us like something sharp, something meant to cut. The days crawled by after the call. I went to work, stood in front of rows of restless teenagers, graded more papers, drank coffee that tasted faintly like metal, answered colleagues who asked how I was holding up, walked the soaked sidewalks of my neighborhood until the cold settled into my clothes. My place was small, barely enough for one person, but it held a strange kind of steadiness I had grown used to over the years, far different from the world the elder one lived in, with her large house, her polished life, her carefully arranged success that always seemed ready to be photographed for someone else's approval, and yet I had come to accept my own path, even if no one else understood it. On the morning of the reading, I put on the only formal outfit I owned, the one that smelled faintly of dust and old air, the one I saved for moments of obligation. The drive was long and wet, the kind of journey where the world outside the windshield blurred into streaks of grey. I arrived early and sat in the car, watching people move with purpose across the street, each step confident, as if they all knew exactly where they belonged. By the time I entered the tall building where everything would be decided, my hands had gone cold. The person at the desk pointed me toward a quiet room high above the city, and there she was already waiting, the elder one, sitting upright with that perfect posture she wore like armor. She glanced up at me without warmth, offering a greeting that sounded more like an evaluation than a simple acknowledgement. I answered politely and took a seat far enough away that neither of us had to pretend. The air between us felt like a long corridor, stretching back through all the years we'd spent avoiding the truth of who we had become to each other. Before either of us could fumble through small talk, the woman in charge entered, her expression steady but gentle, carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed far too many families fall apart in similar rooms. A second person followed her, carrying a thick folder. The moment she said the woman who raised us had left detailed instructions, something inside me shifted, a quiet thrum of unease that I could not name. Then she began to speak about numbers so large they didn't feel real, numbers tied to a life I had never fully understood, even though I'd grown up in its shadow. I saw the elder one go still, her fingers tightening around the device in her hand. Everything in the room narrowed, the air thinning, and in that suspended pause I felt the first tremor of something I could not yet explain, something that would reshape everything I thought I knew about the past, the woman who raised us, and the truth waiting beneath her silence. The woman at the head of the table lifted a sheet of paper with a calmness that felt almost cruel in a room like that, and when her voice shifted into that formal tone, the kind meant for legal certainties and irreversible truths, something inside me braced without meaning to, because I could feel the elder one sharpening beside me. She sat taller, shoulders squared, like she already knew the world would tilt in her favor. Then the words dropped into the room one by one, heavy and impossible. A number so large it barely made sense, a fortune built over decades, a legacy carved from ambition and long nights, and a kind of ruthless determination I had never fully understood. The elder one did not react at first. Not visibly, but her fingers closed tighter around the edge of the table, just enough to make the slightest sound. When the woman continued describing the properties, the investments, the holdings spread across cities we barely knew, I felt myself drift for a moment, as if I were listening to someone else's story. None of it felt tied to me. Not the tall buildings the woman who raised us once controlled, not the elegant house where the elder one had always shone brightest, not the meetings or the portfolios or the polished world I had long stepped away from. Then the pause came, a long inhale, a deliberate shift of the paper, and everything broke. The elder one was given a number, still large enough to stagger most people, along with a collection of personal belongings, small bright things that once lived in boxes and drawers, things she had admired for years. But the way her face froze told me she had expected more, much more. The air tightened around us even before the next words came, and when they finally did, when I heard that everything else, all of it, the entire empire, the entire world built by the woman who raised us, was being placed into my hands, the room tilted. The elder one jolted upright, her chair scraping loud against the floor, her voice cut through the air, sharp and brittle, demanding explanations, demanding corrections, demanding the universe rearrange itself around her disbelief. She spoke about my life, about how I had chosen a smaller world, how I was unprepared, unqualified, unworthy of the responsibility that had just been dropped into my lap. She spoke like the words themselves could undo the decision already sealed in ink. I tried to speak, tried to say something that would calm her, but she was already spiraling into the kind of fury she had perfected since childhood, the kind that came from a lifetime of knowing she would always be first in every lineup. The woman in charge answered gently but firmly, stating the will had been updated recently, that every signature was valid, that no illness had clouded judgment, that nothing said in that room could alter what had been written. The elder one faltered then. Not much, just enough that her breath caught for a moment, as if she had finally collided with something too solid to push aside. Then the envelopes appeared, two small shapes placed between us like quiet detonations. Mine was heavier, thicker, as though it carried the weight of years folded inside. The elder one stared at hers as if it might accuse her the moment she touched it. When she demanded I open mine, her voice cracked on the edges, and for a heartbeat, she no longer sounded like the invincible figure she had always pretended to be. My fingers shook as I slid them under the seal. The paper inside felt warm somehow, as if it remembered the hand that had written it. The handwriting was unmistakable, looping and elegant. The same hand that once wrote notes tucked into lunch bags, the same that signed permission slips, the same that had held onto mine when the world felt too loud. I began to read, and with the first line, the room dissolved. The elder one disappeared. The windows and the city below blurred. Even the steady rain against the glass faded into nothing. There was only the voice of the woman who raised us speaking across time, telling truths she had buried so deep, neither of us had ever thought to dig for them. Her confession curled through the room, carrying the tremor of regret, the shadow of fear, and the terrifying honesty of someone who had run out of time. Every sentence pulled apart a piece of the past we thought we knew. Every detail rewrote the years between us. And as her words unfolded, filling the quiet space between heartbeats, I felt the ground shift again. Not from shock this time, but from the terrible clarity of understanding that the life I had lived, the choices I had made, the sacrifices I had buried in silence, were finally rising to the surface, where no one could look away anymore. The first lines of the message hit me like a quiet blow, the kind that doesn't hurt all at once but spreads through the chest in slow waves, and I felt myself sinking into the chair as the voice of the woman who raised me filled my head more completely than any sound in that room. She wrote about the year everything began to slip, the small moments she hid from everyone except the mirror, the names she misplaced, the rooms she walked into without knowing why, the way she tried to explain it all away with excuses even she didn't believe. I could almost see her in that kitchen years earlier, staring at the machine she had used every morning of my childhood, pressing her fingers against the counter as if it might whisper the answer. She said she knew long before the diagnosis that her mind was turning into something unfamiliar, that the fear tasted like metal in her mouth, that the memory of her own mother's unraveling haunted her like a shadow that clung to the walls. She wrote about refusing to tell the elder one, refusing to tell anyone, about the terror that her empire would crumble the moment the world sensed weakness, about how every detail of her identity had been built on never faltering. I could feel her panic as she described the meetings she barely survived, the notes she wrote to herself in careful loops so she could read her own life like a script, the way she pasted confidence over the fractures forming inside her. When she wrote about that winter holiday, the one when I came home without warning, something inside me clenched because I remembered it exactly. I remembered walking into the kitchen and seeing her frozen in front of that machine, her eyes wide and empty, her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but couldn't find the words. I remembered the ache in my stomach as I watched her, the instinct to protect rising so fast I couldn't breathe. She wrote that she saw the truth in my face even before I asked the question, that she felt the world she had been desperately holding together start to collapse the moment she sat across from me and whispered the diagnosis she had hoped she could outrun. She said she begged me not to give up my life, not to return home, not to fold myself into the quiet role of caretaker, but the moment I told her I would come back, she knew she couldn't stop me. She said the look in my eyes that day told her I had already thrown my future onto the table like an offering. Reading that line made my throat close. I could still feel the weight of that decision, the moment I walked out of the gleaming office where I once imagined a long, ambitious life, and boarded a plane back to the city I swore I would never return to. The woman who raised me wrote about those early months, how I stepped into her world without hesitation, how I became the keeper of her days, the quiet shield standing between her and anyone who might discover what she was losing. She described evenings when I sat beside her going through files, mornings when I held her schedule like a fragile map, afternoons when I answered questions for her with a steady voice before she had the chance to forget what she wanted to say. She called me her memory, her scaffolding, the unseen force holding her life upright. She wrote about how the elder one visited without noticing the truth, how she never questioned why the woman who raised us always had notes laid neatly beside the phone, why I always hovered close enough to catch a dropped detail before it could shatter. She admitted she was grateful and ashamed all at once. Grateful that the elder one never saw the cracks, ashamed that she allowed me to carry the burden alone. As the words continued to unfurl, she described the years when her mind dimmed further, when familiar rooms felt strange, when familiar faces slipped away before she could grasp them. She wrote that each time she woke not remembering where she was, I was the one who steadied her, that even when her memories thinned into something brittle, the sound of my voice still found her. She said I gave her 8 more years of dignity, 8 years where she could pretend she was still herself, 8 years where the world still treated her like the force she had always been. And when she wrote that, she knew the cost of those years, that she understood she had taken something from me I would never get back. Something deep in me cracked, a quiet breaking I had never allowed myself to feel. The last lines of that section trembled on the page, confessing that she hid the truth from the elder one, not out of cruelty but out of terror, that she feared shattering the image her daughter clung to, that she could not bear to let both her children watch her disappear piece by piece. She wrote that she carried guilt every single day, that she wondered if I resented her in the dark hours of the night, that she hoped I would one day understand why she allowed the secret to swallow us whole. Reading that, I felt the room tilt again, not from surprise but from the heavy realization that the woman who raised me had been fighting a battle in the shadows long before I stepped into the line of fire, and the truth of it pressed against my ribs until I could barely breathe.